I'm Lee
Okay.
Moore,
I'm Rob Moore.
and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, you're literally dialing it in from France today. Thank you for making the time late at night.
Literally dialing it in, but not figuratively. Figuratively, I'm not dialing.
It's
Yes, it is late. Well, you say late at night. For me, it's late at night. I'm one of those people that's in bed by 9, so it's 9 o'clock now. And I'm thinking, man, this is a commit. For other people, this doesn't even count.
this is I mean that's pretty early for me, but still it's all
Yeah,
comparative, right? I mean we've all read our Zhuangzi.
yeah, that's true. That's very true.
I mean you said you're dialing it in literally but not figuratively. This text is kind of a hard text to dial in figuratively because it's
It is.
so profound. Can you tell us a little bit of
Well,
what
and
we're looking at?
yeah, first of all, we should say that we're doing this podcast, and the quality of the recording may not be great because we're recording long distance, but we sort of felt compelled to do this podcast because May 4th of this year is the 100th anniversary of the May 4th movement of 1919, which for a lot of literary history, other scholars, is sort of the big bang for modern Chinese literature. Of course, that's debatable, but that's sort of the mainstream viewpoint anyway.
Yeah. I
And
would
the
actually
text,
argue that it's maybe the most important top 5 most important days in the history of China, not just Chinese literature, but China in the 20th century.
and the text we're talking about is the preface to Lu Xun's 1922 printing of Nahan, which is Warcry. It's possibly the most written about thing in modern Chinese literature. Some of Lu Xun's short stories may trump that, but I've seen parts of this preface in, I think, every text I've read about modern Chinese literature.
Yeah.
It's this,
You can't talk about modern Chinese literature without dealing with the preface to Nahan. Nahan, by the way, is oftentimes times translated as Outcry or Warcry or something like that. It's the 1922 book that Lu Xun publishes in with a collection of the stories that he wrote. Some of them he wrote in 1919 as the May 4th movement is gathering steam.
yeah. And what's fascinating to me about this, as with all things Lu Xun, is that his legacy tends to color people's reading of his actual writings so much that sometimes I wonder if they're actually reading them. There's a ton of stuff in the preface. I mean, we could do a series of podcasts just on the preface.
Yeah.
But we should probably talk about maybe the 2 or 3 most famous episodes.
Yeah, that part of the preface about his med school experiences is I think, the probably most written about moment in all of Chinese literature. If the preface isn't, then that is. In the preface, Lu Xun just talks about how his dad had died because a quack Chinese medicinal doctor had charged him money for bad medicine and kept just bleeding the family dry. And the family lost all its money trying to save their father on some medicine that wasn't effective. And so Lu Xun at that moment, he swears he's going to become a doctor. He swears that that's how he's going to save China. He's going to learn Western science, learn Western medicine, and become a doctor. He's going to become the man who could have saved his dad. So that's his goal when he goes to Japan. But then he gets there, and he's in this microbiology class at, I believe, the University of Sendai. After the class is over, they finish showing microbiology slides and they start showing just random slides from the news that the teacher has. And one of them shows an image of a Japanese soldier about to behead a Chinese man. He's surrounded by other Chinese men. It's during the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905, which was surprisingly largely fought in Chinese territory in the area that's today called Dongbei in China, and in English it's often called Manchuria. He sees all of these Chinese people around this Japanese officer, and they're not doing anything to save this Chinese man. And he comes to this epiphany: I can't save the bodies of Chinese people with medical science until I save the souls of Chinese people. And I'll do that by writing stuff.
and it's a testament of it doesn't really matter what you do with the body unless you can heal the soul, as it were.
Yeah. I think it's one of the most powerful and moving moments in all of Chinese literature. And it's not a story, or we think it's largely based on fact. There's still some debate over how factual it is. I mean, this preface, one of the questions I have when I read this preface is, how much do I trust Lu Xun? He's writing a work of fiction, but this seems like it's not fiction.
It's believable. I mean, if you've read enough about that era, you can totally see how a situation like that beheading and that being on a film strip could totally happen.
But it's believable, but do you believe it, Rob?
I believe it. But one of the reasons that I believe it is because of what Lu Xun writes for most of the rest of his career. And this is one of the things that I find peculiar about the reception of Lu Xun, because if you actually really read Lu Xun, one of the themes that emerges over and over again is a creeping sense of dread and hopelessness. This feeling that maybe nothing I'm doing matters at all. And if the moment that initiates your literary career is looking at a crowd of people watching one of their own being beheaded, possibly for nothing, and they're all just sort of standing there bored, there has to be a sense in which you're like, wait, how do you address people like that? If they're so jaded, they don't care if one of their neighbors is getting beheaded for nothing. What can you possibly write to reach people like that?
I wanted to ask you, Rob, you mentioned the word neighbors, that these people are looking at their neighbors and they're not doing anything about this Japanese officer who's going to behead him. How much of it, what role does Chineseness, that is Chinese identity, play in this story? Because that's the way it's always interpreted for me when I was in China, or when I was in classes on Chinese literature. That's how this is always told. It's China as a nation needs to wake up, and before, Chinese people had been in this stupor, and Lu Xun's Outcry is an outcry to wake them up. It's to go, hey, you are Chinese, you need to protect other Chinese people, and you need to stand up for Chinese people when the Japanese are pushing them around. How much of this is
right?
So that I find that explanation, both it echoes a lot of what's going on today in modern American politics, the sort of identitarian movement. You need to connect with other people of your ethnicity and other people of your group. And I also find it not particularly valid. I don't know that Lu Xun is saying you need to care about this person who's going to be beheaded because you're Chinese and they're Chinese and that makes you alike. I kind of interpret him as saying this is another person who you should care about. You should care about them because they're a person, not because they're Chinese. What do you think?
Well, that's an interesting interpretation. I know that the comments that directly follow this are about Chinese people, like healing the souls of the nation. But it's interesting. It's an interesting point you raised, because one of the other things that we notice in Lu Xun's writings is there's a real slipperiness to what he says he's going to do and what he actually does. And by that I don't mean he's sort of, deceitful or something. But he ends up pursuing things that aren't necessarily his goal. If you read the rest of this collection, for example, if your goal was to wake up the people of your nation, and to some extent I think that's what he's doing, simply because most of his stories involve very distinctly Chinese themes. But they're also very odd. There's more than one that you can read and reread and reread and still go, that's really strange. What's he doing here? You would think you would go about waking the people of your nation up with pretty straightforward, almost propagandistic pieces. That's not what he's doing.
I don't think this is propagandistic, but I think that, and this is one of the problems I have with reading Lu Xun, is the way he's taught, particularly in the PRC. It does fit in this nice, neat narrative where everything kind of works out and it's always about the Chinese nation. And it becomes propaganda. It's used as propaganda. But It only becomes propaganda when you flatten out this text and say, this is the right way to read it. There's only one right way, and this is the right way.
One of the things we might want to ask, though, is when Lu Xun says Chinese people, what does he mean? Because I think you're right. I don't think you're right. I know you're right. He's the great patriot, the great revolutionary. I mean, even in Maoist China, he has poems written about him as this revolutionary hero. You know, at the point he's writing this collection, to be Chinese, what does that mean? Lu Xun's vision. I mean, this is something that I think just does not get taught. But between the point when he actually sees the film strip, the slide of the Chinese version being beheaded, and the time when he puts it in print is almost 2 decades. And in between that time, he pursues a ton of different literary projects, most of them translation. Then he gives up. And then he writes, which is in fact the end of this preface. That's what he's writing about. He starts out more or less by saying, I went to Japan to become a doctor and heal everyone. And then I saw this and realized I needed to heal their souls. Well, except that what happens after that is he gives it a shot. Nothing works. No one cares. No one reads it for almost 2 freaking decades. And then he's back in China and he's talking with an old friend, and the friend says, hey, why don't you put some of your writings in print? And Lu Xun basically said, and this is all in the preface, by the way, this is the last part of the preface, is this conversation. He says to his friend, what's the freaking point, basically? Then Lu Xun gives his very famous Iron House analogy.
Tell us about the Iron House, Rob.
Well, suppose that we were all in Iron House. Now, he says to his friend, suppose we were all in an Iron House. No windows, we're all closed in. Everyone is asleep. Everyone's effectively in a coma. But there's a handful of us who've woken up. Now, if you knew there was no way really to break apart the Iron House, would you wake anyone else up? And his friend says, yeah, but if there's already some people awake, maybe enough people awake, you can make a difference. And Lu Xun goes, all right, maybe I will publish and stuff. But it's interesting that what starts his literary career off is this sort of crusading, heroic, I'm going to save the country with my writing movement. And what ends the preface is him basically shrugging his shoulders and going, well, all right, I guess if you think so, why not? Like, it's not this passionate declaration of the power of literature. It's riddled with doubt.
Yeah, if I could use the words from the text, he says, the experience filled me with an entirely novel feeling of futility and failure. Futility and failure. Those are the 2 words that I take away from this text. He feels this is the guy who's taught everywhere in China during the Cultural Revolution. His face is on posters all over as the symbol of a strong China. And this is why I think his use in propaganda is totally wrong. Everything about this text, that's including the preface, but also the whole of Nahan or Outcry, there's this sense of futility and failure hovering over it. And you're never, I mean, if you feel like you understand this text, I think you have misinterpreted it. You miss something. Because as soon as he offers one possible reading, he'll take that away and move it to something totally different, which is what I love about Lu Xun.
It's my favorite thing about Lu Xun. And I'm with you. I think one of the things that's sad is that he does get taught as such a black and white writer that you miss so many of these subtle details that he's either withholding or not giving you the whole thing. It's interesting that this preface is so written about, and it always seems to come across as a sort of manifesto, but it's a really dark manifesto, if so. And to some extent, it is his manifesto, but it's not the manifesto people tend to talk about. It is a very clear-eyed description of what it's like trying to save the country or save your people, save people through literature. And ultimately, and this is something, like I said before, that people don't talk about, is that it's the history leading up to this, the 2 decades or so of trying and failing, that makes this preface so powerful. It's him saying, I've done my time. I've worked, I've struggled, I've strived, I've taught in schools, I've published in journals. Nobody freaking cares, man. I mean, that's the reality of a situation like this. And it's interesting to talk about this text on the anniversary of the May 4th movement, because it is sort of the canonical text of the May 4th movement, but perhaps not in the way that a lot of people are gonna talk about.
As we're kind of wrapping up here, the two words to take away from Lu Xun's preface are futility and failure. Can I ask you a big question?
Go for it.
Was the May 4th movement a failure?
Yeah, it's funny because I just emailed a friend of mine who's a professor in China. Actually, I don't even know his friend. Anyway, he and I have exchanged quite a few emails about Lu Xun. And I just tossed him that question. I said, here's the thing. So the May 4th movement produced some stunning literature. The problem is the vast majority of people didn't read it. Just like, James Joyce in Ireland, or, say, Thomas Pynchon in the United States. Like, aesthetically brilliant. Do most people read them? No, not really. Anytime you do something brand new, totally new, no one's ever seen it, no one's ever read it before, you're not going to have a lot of readers. And this is something that other of Lu Xun's comrades and compatriots talk about. I think Xu Qiubai, the great Marxist Soviet commentator and friend of Lu Xun's, wrote about in the 30s. He said, people are reading a lot. They're just not reading any of the May 4th like new literature stuff. They're reading all the old stuff, the classics. And so I think you have to ask the question in maybe a different way. Was it a popular success? No, it was a popular failure. Nobody read this stuff. Was it an artistic success? I would say yes. If you've read Nahan, really read Nahan, not read the rose-colored glasses, or the red glasses, I should say, of the 20th century Chinese propaganda, it's a stunning piece of writing. I would confidently put it on any list of the greatest writings of the 20th century. But as a sort of rousing war cry, it didn't rouse a lot of people.
So here's my take on whether the May 4th is a failure or not. The May 4th was trying to promote two separate people. That was De Xianzheng and Cai Xianzheng. Now, De Xianzheng is Mr. Democracy, and Cai Xianzheng is Mr. Science. And I think if you go to China today, you'll see Mr. Science. He's there. When I talk to my students from the PRC, they have this faith in science that is it's difficult to believe. And you think about the kinds of science that's being produced in China, artificial intelligence, those kinds of things. China has become a world leader in science. It's a power to be reckoned with in science. But what about democracy? What about Mr. Democracy?
I think if you were to go back and ask Lu Xun, he'd probably agree with you that hooray for science, but what about everything else?
There's so much more we can talk about this, but I would say that the May 4th movement, looking back on it 100 years later, is a half successful, half failure. How about that?
And my parting thought on this is, as with a lot of literature that is focused on kind of a social goal, if you don't read deep enough, or if you don't think about it enough, you miss what's really happening here. And I do think that Lu Xun was trying to wake people up, but he was trying to wake people up to something a lot deeper than just, we're getting pushed around by other countries, or we have a really corrupt leadership, or our traditional texts are killing us. It has much more to do with, okay, fine, but what are you doing? What are you, the reader, doing? Are you investing in what you're reading? Are you thinking? Are you critically involved? Or are you just letting smarter people make all your decisions for you because you don't feel like dealing with it? And I think that's one of the reasons why these texts are so difficult to read.
Rob, I think that's a great place to end it. Happy May 4th.
Happy anniversary.
Happy anniversary of futility and failure. All right.
An incredibly brilliant piece of literature.
Yes, absolutely. This is something that you should read. Get a copy of it. I guess we'll just sign off. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.